Wow. What a lovely in-common room this is. And it's so richly detailed and vibrant. Oh, remarkable, just remarkable. Oh, it's good to get out of the rain into just another gorgeous in-common room. Oh, just as detailed as the last one, but unique in every way. Wow, wow, no way. Oh, how many different ways are there to show an in-common room? I shan't think I'd ever get bored of this. Many in-common rooms later, oh boy, another richly detailed, unique in-common room. I can't wait to hear about this for 4 pages. Oh wow, look, this one has a half-sized wall. Fascinating. Hello, wonderful people. I hope everyone's had a good new year so far. I want to talk about my 2024 fantasy reading challenge. So for anyone who doesn't know, my fantasy reading challenge I put in place because I have historically been a sci-fi and horror reader for most of my life, and I've been avoiding fantasy. Fantasy was a genre I struggled to get excited about, but it probably is the biggest genre in a lot of the bookshops I go to, so I figured I was doing myself a disservice by avoiding the genre. So I decided to challenge myself to really get into the genre. I decided that I would read and review 10 fantasy books in 2024, and then after that, if I still wasn't excited about fantasy, then clearly fantasy wasn't for me. What? 2025? Yeah, but I read it and wrote the review for it in 2024, so I'm counting it. Fight me. Very early on in the challenge, I decided that my book 10 was going to be this book, based on lots of factors. It's a huge running series, people love it. A great friend of mine, Dan from Digger Dan Reads on YouTube, check him out, ℙ𝕚𝕚𝕚. It's his favourite series of all time, and he has been bullying me relentless to start it. I am, of course, talking about Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, and the book today is The Eye of the World. Eye of the World by Robert Jordan is the first of 14 books in the Wheel of Time series, an epic fantasy series spanning approximately 40 million pages. In Eye of the World, we're introduced to the world itself. We're introduced to our characters, namely our, I would say, main character, Rand. Rand is a shepherd boy. All he knows of his life is living in this small town, out of the way of the main trade routes. Very few visitors to this town, the occasional merchant, the occasional bard, but beyond that, Rand's life as he knows it is tending to sheep, taking produce into town to sell, and going to festivals in his small rural village. This festival, there are a few new guests. There is a bard. This is a big deal for this village. There are 2 very well-dressed individuals who are of a bit of a concern to some of the residents of the small village, not used to people with such wealth showing up. And it is just before this festival starts that we have our inciting incident. Something happens in the town, something happens to Rand and to his family and his friends that means he must leave the town and flee somewhere else. And along with him goes some of his friends, his friend Matt, his friend Perrin, and his friend and love interest 𝕚𝕚𝕚, and along with the 3 richly dressed companions that came to the city, being the bard, 𝕤𝕚𝕚𝕚, the warder, and the Aes Sedai, who is a sort of witch, basically. There are folk tales told about these witches, about these magic users, and they all end in tragedy. And now Rand and his friends have to decide if they can trust these individuals, believe in what they're saying, believe that they're taking them to safety, all while avoiding the gaze of the Dark One and of his minions and monsters and enemies that are trying to hunt them down. And what we end up with is a sort of chase story as our characters need to get from point A to point B, and they're being pursued and blocked and whatnot along the way. Now, I don't know if there's a lot I can say about Eye of the World that hasn't already been said. This is a very popular book. Most people that do fantasy stuff on YouTube have read and reviewed it, so I'm going to skip the whole no spoiler thing I normally try and do on this channel, and I'm just going to jump right into spoilers. If you haven't read this book and you care about spoilers, my overall suggestion for you is, yeah, read it. It's worth it. I was terrified of starting this book, and all of my assumptions were blown out of the water. This isn't the long, slow slog that I was thinking it was going to be. It was exciting, captivating, and enjoyable from start to finish. So, that being said, let's get started knocking some of these assumptions over. So as I said, I was really scared of reading this book. It's, you know, 3 million pages long. It's the first of 14 books, and a lot of things people have said to me online made me really worried about starting. So I went into this book with a number of assumptions, and today's video I want to kind of skip the what I liked, what I didn't like thing, and I just want to kind of start knocking over some of those assumptions and talking about them. First, the assumption is that the book is long and slow. This is an assumption I sort of made just by looking at it. I mean, it's 7 million pages long, but I've also been told by a lot of people that it's slow. The first book is very slow. The book is long? Yeah, absolutely. There's no getting away with that. It's a long book. The book is slow? I actually don't think so. I think the pacing of this book is pretty breakneck, except for, as I hinted at the start of the video, way too many visits to different in-common rooms. It's really, really good. Robert Jordan's prose is at times overly descriptive, mostly when it's talking about the 15th in-common room he's describing. But you don't go a chapter without major events really happening. Things are happening on every page of this book, and the tension means that I was kept reading. I never felt like the book got bogged down. I never felt like we slowed the pace. I felt like we were really moving all the way from the start to the finish, and this being sort of like a high tension chase book, I think really helps with that. Next is kind of two things that I've been hearing. One is that this is just kind of the introduction, you know? This is something that I've worried about a lot with first books. One of my big pet peeves is when you read a book that is number one in a series, you finish it, and you're like, great. That didn't accomplish anything. You know, the main narrative never finished. It was just serving as book one of a series, and the whole point of it was to make you buy book two. And that's just not true here. If this was the only Wheel of Time book, there would be a million questions up in the air. But the main story that is happening in this book of Rand and his friends trying to get to the Aes Sedai Tower, which gets ____ to go to the Eye of the World, that kind of accomplishes. Clearly, we know as readers that the story's not finished, but if Robert Jordan had written this and then got hit by a car, people would still read and be happy with this book, which is not something I can say about a lot of fantasy books, not something I can say about a lot of books. There are a lot of books where I feel like if you read book one and then they never got okayed for book two, no one would read book one because it's not very good on its own. But this is a perfectly good standalone book. If you read this and don't want to continue, I think you're still going to be perfectly happy with the narrative here. Next, so many people told me when I was reading this book that, oh, don't worry, you just have to get through this book and then you get to some of the better ones. People were saying, oh, I know it's daunting starting a 14-book series and it's not one of the good ones. One, that makes me so excited for the rest of these books because I loved Eye of the World. Part of it might be because I just don't have the fantasy reading history that a lot of other people do. So a lot of the things that might have annoyed people in this book just didn't annoy me. They were, you know, I could tell the tropes were there, but they were still novel to me. And I think part of it is a lot of people say the Rand and Mat section gets really bogged down. And that is where all of the inn visits come in, which, you know, I agree, there's too many of those. Robert Jordan doesn't need to spend 2 pages describing a common room of each new inn we go to. But I didn't really understand the complaints about Mat and Rand's storyline. I thought it was great. I feel like maybe some of the problems come from it just being the sort of darker and sadder of the storylines that are going on at that point in time. Like, you've got Perrin dealing with the wolves, that's very interesting. You've got Egwene and Perrin dealing with the roaming band of people, and that's really interesting. You've got, what's her name? You've got Moraine, Lan, and Nynaeve? I'm going to say Nynaeve, dealing with their sort of mistrust of each other and hunting down the boys, and that's fascinating. So I can see why people might not be enjoying the sort of tonal shift to Rand and Mat's depressing adventure across a bunch of in-common rooms. But I think it's really good. I think it shows a bit of the life and a bit of the world that the other stories don't really get to show. And obviously all the stuff with Thom Merrill is fantastic. Another complaint I see a lot is people saying that the ending is very rushed. And I get that as a complaint. The actual, like, the physical pages that the ending takes up is very small compared to a lot of the other acts in the book. But I didn't feel like I got shorted of an ending. I didn't feel like I got shortchanged. I felt like I now see where Brandon Sanderson gets this Sanderlanche thing from. I see where that inspiration kind of comes from now. I think Robert Jordan did a great job of setting everything up and then in the ending knocking all those dominoes over very quickly. But not in a way that felt rushed. I felt that it all made perfect sense. We didn't need to spend a lot of time examining them because the bones of them all were set up beforehand in the book. And I thought the ending was fantastic. And once I got to like the last 100 pages or so, I just couldn't put the book down. I just had to finish it. And then finally, another assumption I see a lot is that people just say that it's very Tolkien derivative. And I mean, maybe. It's been a long time since I read Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, but I see it. It's a journey across an area. I think once you get past that opening scene, the Tolkien connections very quickly disappear. There's a very different sort of level of tension here. You know, Lord of the Rings, they're making their way across this long journey. They're being hunted, but not chased. They're trying to hunt it down, and they have an area they need to get to. Whereas here, they're being hunted. I feel like the tension is kind of flipped. The initiative of each side is flipped in this book. And I found it really fascinating. I find the idea that, you know, I can see where the connection comes with, like, you know, Gandalf showing up and telling people they need to go on an adventure, and Moiraine showing up and saying they need to go on an adventure. And I think I've read this somewhere else before, but I really like the idea that Moiraine shows up, tells the boys they need to go on an adventure, and everyone was like, who are you? Why should we trust you? Magic users are bad news. Why would we trust a random witch coming into our town and telling us what to do? So while, yes, I can see the Tolkien, you know, influence, I don't think it's derivative in a bad way. All fantasy these days seems to be Tolkien derivative, right? So what can you do? I want to talk about, like, sort of the tropes, and I feel like I was very well placed to read this book now in my fantasy reading journey. I'm reading through this and I'm getting annoyed at things like Matt taking that dagger and Rand knowing he took the dagger, and Matt's acting all angry and sad and violent. And it's like, yeah, he has a cursed dagger. Or Rand talking to the beggar in the city and just being like, who was the merchant. I mean, like, yeah, we're staying at this inn over here. Why don't you trust us? And then the merchant runs away and then he never thinks about it again. But I have to remind myself that, one, the book's a little bit older. It came before a lot of these tropes were done a lot. And two, in universe, these are farm boys. They are naive. They should be naive. Why would a farm boy know a lot of stuff? Why would a farm boy have read 15 books about cursed swords and cursed daggers and know what's going on? They just wouldn't, so that's all fine. The characters, I thought the characters were lovely. I love Rand. I really liked Perrin as well. Nynaeve is probably one of my favorite characters. I love this strong, young woman in a position of power who is, you know, challenged by her town and by the members of her town because she's so young, who has this level of magic within her that she's trying to deny, and this vivid distrust of Moiraine, but is going along with the whole thing to try and save the boys of her town, who she feels are her responsibility. I love the magic system that we're kind of touching on. I want to know more. I'm really hoping book 2 tells us more about the magic system. I love the world building. I really loved meeting L'Oreal at the end, the sort of _ogre character. That's not their name. I can't remember what it was right now. But I thought that was fascinating. I thought the enemies are great. They're not like traditional orcs and goblins. I thought all the baddies were fantastic. I thought the antagonist was great. Honestly, I've got very little to complain about in this book. It's just basically the inn common rooms that grated on me a bit. You know, by the time you're reading the 10th inn common room and you spent 2 pages describing the bar and the patrons and the bartender, I'm like, yeah, okay, it's another inn common room. And it makes sense. You know, you're traveling on a road, you're gonna stay at inns, but it is what it is. So, final thoughts and rating for The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. My final thoughts are, this is a fantastic first book of an epic fantasy series. It is low level enough, close enough to the ground, focusing on our main characters, that we can connect with them, while also showing the sort of political intrigue that is going on in the greater world, hinting at events that are going to come forward later, and putting in place the stepping stones to lead us up to it. And I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. I really loved this book, and I really was surprised. I didn't expect to like it this much. 2 bits of housekeeping at the end then. First, this is the last of my 10 fantasy books that I read in 2024. Am I now a fantasy reader? Do I like fantasy now? Or am I just going to go back to horror and sci-fi? Well, yeah, absolutely. I love fantasy now. Of all the books, the ones that really stood out for me, Between Two Fires made me realize that, oh, this is a bit fantasy, and I really enjoyed it. And then the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson made me go, oh, this is what sort of like big epic fantasy can be. That was really exciting. This genre was exciting to me. Kings of the Wild is still my favorite fantasy book I read last year. It made me realize that fantasy can be really character driven with fantastic, lovely characters who make me laugh, who make me cry, and it was just a breath of fresh air. And then Eye of the World. I'm going to read the series now, or I'm at least going to continue with the next book, which terrifies me because it is, I don't know, 700 million pages long, but I'm excited to read them. Secondly, this is a bingo book. I had been eyeing this square since I started bringing up my bingo board. This is Our Fantasies Bingo. There are 25 reading prompts. They are here. The idea is to read ones that match the prompts and then fill out the bingo board. I'm trying to finish and review every square. These are the ones I've done. And for today's square, I am looking at the first in a series challenge. The hard mode for this one is that it has to be a series with over 5 books. There are 14 books in this series, I think 15 if you count the prequel. So yeah, it absolutely fits here. So I'm putting Robert Jordan's Eye of the World in that square. And there you have it. That's the first book of the Wheel of Time series. I now get to pick up The Great Hunt, and I'm really excited to read it. I'm probably going to read it next. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. See you next time. Keep reading.